The start of World War II wasn't just a single gunshot or a sudden declaration of war. It began much earlier, in quiet rooms where crucial decisions were delayed, and in public squares where anger was left to fester. While history often points to September 1939 as the official beginning, the real origins of the war were hidden years before in fear, humiliation, ambition, and silence. Let's uncover the secrets that led the world down the path to its deadliest conflict. After the devastation of the First World War, the world made a solemn promise: never again. Treaties were signed, hopeful speeches were made, and a new era of peace seemed possible. But beneath this fragile surface, the peace was deeply flawed. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to bring justice, instead brought punishment to Germany. It stripped the nation of territory, dismantled its military, and wounded its national pride. For millions of Germans, what was meant to be a resolution felt like a profound humiliation. Their economy collapsed under the weight of reparations. Hyperinflation wiped out savings, and unemployment spread like a plague. In this climate of desperation, dignity gave way to despair, and trust was replaced by a simmering resentment. This toxic environment became fertile ground for extremist ideas. He tapped into Germany's wounded pride, offering simple, hateful answers to complex and painful problems. He pointed to scapegoats, promised a return to glory, and demanded absolute loyalty. Many people listened, not necessarily because they fully believed every word, but because they were desperate for any glimmer of hope. He openly rejected the post-war order and declared his ambition for expansion. Yet, foreign governments saw him as a temporary problem, a political storm that would eventually pass. They underestimated the depth of the anger he channeled, believing that time and diplomacy would naturally cool the flames. At the very same time, another secret was unfolding halfway across the world. Japan, facing its own crisis of limited resources and immense ambition, was on the move. Driven by a desire for power and regional dominance, it invaded Manchuria in 1931. This was a blatant violation of international law, and it exposed the fatal weakness of global institutions. The League of Nations, the world's best hope for collective security, issued a condemnation but did nothing to stop the invasion. In response, Japan simply walked away from the negotiating table and continued its campaign of conquest. The message sent to other ambitious nations was loud and clear: aggression carried no real consequences. The world's resolve was just an illusion. Inspired by Japan's success, Italy followed a similar path. In 1935, Mussolini's forces invaded Ethiopia, another sovereign nation. Dictators were learning a critical lesson: the world feared confrontation more than it valued justice. Each act of aggression was a test of the global community's limits, and each time, those limits crumbled. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Hitler began to systematically dismantle the rules designed to contain his nation. He secretly rebuilt the military, training new soldiers and producing advanced weapons in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Then, in a bold move, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone. But there was no resistance, no armies moved to oppose him, no punishment followed. What should have been a red line became a green light. A crucial stopping point became a catastrophic turning point. The world's leaders told themselves that Germany was simply reclaiming what was rightfully its own, restoring a bit of lost dignity. They convinced themselves that accepting these small violations was a price worth paying to avoid a larger war. This policy, which became known as appeasement, was born from a desire for peace, but would ultimately pave the road to war. Each concession made in the name of peace only strengthened the dictator's belief that force was the only language that mattered. By 1938, Germany's confidence had grown to the point of outright annexation. In March, German troops crossed the border into Austria. The Anschluss, or union of Germany and Austria, shocked many, but it was celebrated by others. A sovereign nation disappeared overnight, absorbed into the Third Reich without a single shot being fired. The real secret here wasn't the invasion itself, but the world's reaction or lack thereof. The absence of any meaningful resistance sent a chilling signal across Europe. National borders were meaningless if a nation was powerful enough to ignore them. At the infamous Munich conference, they agreed to his demands, effectively sacrificing Czechoslovakia to appease him. They did this without even consulting the Czechoslovak government. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, returned home proclaiming he had secured peace for our time. In reality, they had surrendered a democratic nation and abandoned all moral principle. The Munich Agreement wasn't a triumph of diplomacy. It was a demonstration of moral collapse at the very heart of international politics. Behind the public spectacle of diplomacy, an even darker secret was taking shape. Poland, The Baltic states and other nations were designated for either German or Soviet control. This cynical agreement removed the last major obstacle to a full-scale war. With no fear of a two-front conflict, Hitler was now completely free to unleash his military might. Germany invaded Poland, unleashing a new form of warfare called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was designed for speed, shock, and overwhelming terror. German tanks and aircraft struck with devastating force, bombing cities, targeting civilians, and crushing Polish defenses. 2 weeks later, as Poland reeled from the German onslaught, Soviet forces invaded from the east, as agreed upon in the secret pact. Caught between two giants, Poland was crushed and erased from the map. Only then, with Poland's fate sealed, did Britain and France finally declare war on Germany. World War II had officially begun. The war didn't really start in Poland. It started years earlier with ignored warnings, broken promises, and a paralyzing fear that was disguised as diplomacy. The path to war was paved with good intentions that led to disastrous outcomes. The secrets we've uncovered today show that the world didn't stumble into war by accident. It walked there, one compromise step at a time. When World War II finally erupted, the world reacted with shock. But honestly, that shock was a performance. The warning signs had been flashing for years. The real failure wasn't a lack of information, it was a lack of will. Governments knew the risks, but chose to delay. Societies sensed the danger, but clung to comfort. The true secret behind the start of the war isn't just about dictators. It's about the deafening silence that let them rise. As Germany's aggression grew, the democratic nations were paralyzed by trauma. The ghost of World War I haunted every single decision. Millions had died, an entire generation was scarred, and no leader wanted to be the one to drag the world back into that abyss. This fear was understandable, but it became a crippling force. Avoiding a new war became more important than actually preventing one. Public opinion only made things worse. People were more afraid of economic hardship than they were of distant invasions. Newspapers reported on events, sure, but they often softened the blow. Aggression was framed as a negotiation. Disputes were described as regional problems. Dictators were treated like rational men who could be reasoned with. The language of warning was completely replaced by the language of reassurance. At the same time, military readiness plummeted. Defense budgets were slashed, armies were downsized, and equipment was left to rust. Nations put their faith in paper treaties and diplomatic handshakes, not in actual preparation. This created a massive vulnerability. When the inevitable confrontation arrived, many countries were simply not equipped to respond. International institutions like the League of Nations repeatedly showed how powerless they were. The League had no real enforcement power and couldn't get its members to agree on anything. Decisions required total consensus, which was impossible when every nation was only looking out for itself. Each time the League failed, it sent a clear signal to aggressors. International law is optional. Authority without action is just empty words. Meanwhile, secret alliances were forming behind closed doors, speeding up the collapse. While public speeches promised peace, secret deals were being made to carve up the world. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the most shocking example. Two opposing regimes that publicly hated each other agreed to cooperate in secret. This ideological betrayal revealed the cold, hard reality of power politics. Principles meant nothing when ambition was on the line. The invasion of Poland was the breaking point, the moment when denial was no longer an option, but even then, hesitation lingered. Britain and France declared war, but their initial actions were limited. This period, known as the Phony War, showed just how deeply fear was still guiding their strategy. Precious time that could have been used to halt the expansion was lost once again. While Europe hesitated, the conflict was already spreading. Japan continued its brutal expansion in Asia. Atrocities like the Nanjing massacre exposed the horrific human cost of global inaction. And still, the world hoped the conflict could be contained, walled off from the rest of the globe. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered that final illusion. When the United States entered the fight, the conflict became truly global. Only then did the full scale of the failure become clear. A fire that could have been stamped out early now required a worldwide effort to extinguish. The secret behind the start of World War II isn't that leaders didn't know, it's that they knew and did nothing. They chose short-term stability over long-term security. They confused compromise with wisdom and delay with peace. This part of the story is uncomfortable because it proves the war wasn't inevitable. It wasn't destined to happen. It was enabled, step by step, by fear, political calculation, and a retreat from moral responsibility. Each ignored warning just added another brick to the foundation of the coming disaster. By the time the world finally accepted that war was inevitable, The balance of power had already tipped. Years of unchecked expansion had emboldened aggressive regimes, while fatally weakening those who clung to the hope of peace. What came next wasn't a sudden, shocking collapse. It was the final, devastating consequence of choices made in silence and hesitation. Germany's early victories stunned the world, not because they were unpredictable, but because they laid bare just how unprepared everyone else was. The Blitzkrieg, a new form of lightning warfare, completely overwhelmed nations still stuck in the mindset of slow, conventional battles. France, a major European power, fell with breathtaking speed. The horrifying truth dawned across the continent. Hesitation had handed the advantage to those who acted without restraint. Behind the battle lines, civilians paid the ultimate price for this strategic failure. Cities were bombed indiscriminately. Families were torn from their homes, borders vanished overnight, and a constant gnawing fear became the new reality. This war showed that modern conflict no longer made a distinction between soldiers and civilians. Total war meant total suffering. In the occupied nations, a different kind of violence took hold. Resistance movements formed in the shadows, with ordinary people risking everything to fight back. But for many, just existing was a crime. Surveillance, forced labor, and systematic terror became the new tools of government. These weren't just tragic accidents of war. They were the direct extension of ideologies that had been tolerated for far too long. Then, from the depths of this indifference, the Holocaust emerged as its darkest and most terrible consequence. Long before the concentration camps were liberated, the warnings were there. Refugees told stories of unimaginable brutality. Reports detailed systematic persecution. Yet for so many, the doors of the world remained closed. The secret here is a painful one. The genocide wasn't entirely hidden. It was largely ignored. Bureaucracy, disbelief, and a lack of political will became unwitting accomplices to the greatest crime in human history. As the war spread across the globe, alliances hardened. Nations that were once rivals found themselves united against a common, existential threat. The scale of cooperation demanded was unprecedented. Entire economies were retooled for war production, societies were transformed, and populations were mobilized on a scale never seen before. Only through this total all-encompassing commitment did the balance of power finally begin to shift back. Meanwhile, in Asia, the brutality continued with equal ferocity. Imperial ambitions laid waste to entire regions. Civilian massacres, forced labor, and engineered famines became widespread tactics of control. The suffering wasn't a side effect of the war. It was a deliberate method. Power was enforced through absolute fear and destruction. The war dragged on for so long, costing millions upon millions of lives, because the early chances to contain it were missed. Every mile of territory regained, every small victory, came at an unimaginable cost in blood. The world was paying dearly for every year it had delayed taking a stand. As the tide finally began to turn, the truth of the conflict became undeniable. This wasn't just a war between nations. It was a war against ideologies that fed on weakness, division, and silence. Winning required more than just military superiority. It demanded moral clarity. It required understanding what the world was fighting for, not just what it was fighting against. By the time the end was in sight, the world was a landscape of ruins. Cities were flattened, millions were dead, and the global order had been permanently shattered. Victory brought relief, but it also brought a heavy period of reflection. The staggering cost of the war forced humanity to confront the terrifying price of inaction. The real secret behind the start of World War II was only truly understood after its devastating conclusion. Evil doesn't always announce itself with a thunderous roar. Sometimes, it simply advances, step by step, into the space created by those who do nothing to stop it. History books recorded the dates and the battles, but the deeper lesson was written in what wasn't there. The absence of early resistance, the absence of unified courage, and the absence of a collective will to act when it mattered most.